Day 3 of the United Nations Open Source Conference. This was the first day of the OSPOs for Good section, which was primarily about how open source software could or should be used in governments, or for the public good, basically. I wanted to tell you two things I took away from the breakout session I went to, and I wanted to talk about the format of the conference in general, which is a bit different than tech conferences in general. So the breakout session that I wanted to talk to you about was about what policies would we recommend to governments around open source software. And the first thing that came out of it was, why don't countries dedicate a maintenance budget when they decide to use open source software? So if you use open source software, somebody's going to have to maintain it and fix it, but there's rarely a budget associated with that. Whereas if a government builds a bridge, they'll often have a maintenance budget for that bridge. Or they'll ask questions like, if the water went out, what does that mean for people and how are we going to fix it? And they don't always ask the same questions about open source software. So that was really interesting. The second point that came up was like, if you were going to recommend open source software to a government, who would you recommend they talk to? Whose job is it to help governments use open source software, or whose responsibility? And on one hand, there were people that were like, well, we should make it law, and others are like, you'll regret that. And then there were people that were like, software developers shouldn't have to do that. They've already written the software. Like, why would you ask that of them? So those were two interesting points that came out of that session of what policies would you recommend for governments around open source software. The second thing I wanted to talk to you about was the format of the conference in general. So it was really interesting is that most of the sessions yesterday were panels. And typically conference organizers use panels when there's a lot of good voices in the room and they want to hear from as many of them as possible. And so they create panels. But looking at the room, you could see that the United Nations probably often has like a panel of people up front presenting to the rest. And then based on the delegates' response, they're used to a format where there's a panel that presents some ideas, and then they open up the floor, and delegates, they're not sharing an idea or a question, but they have like a prepared statement that they want to make to have it on record. And so when the government officials or people that were part of the UN spoke, they had these like written statements that they said, whereas you could tell us from tech industry just made like our comment off the cuff. So it was interesting to see those two dynamics come together. I personally found the panel format a little hard to follow. I'm used to the speaker trying very hard to be entertaining and keep the attention of the audience, and they didn't have any slides, and they weren't trying to entertain. They were trying to share information, and people were listening very carefully to that information. But it was definitely a very different format, and I thought both groups could take learnings from the other. So that was day 3 of the United Nations Open Source Conference. Lots of good stuff. I just touched on those 2 points, but there's lots of other posts out there if you're looking for more information, and I'm sure there'll be lots of follow-ups later. More later.